Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the fourth and final session of our Data Science Career Seminar Series, Bringing Data Science to Addiction Research. My name is Susan Wright, and I'm from the Division of Neuroscience and Behavior. I'm the Program Director for Big Data and Computational Science, and I'm leading our data science efforts here at NIDA. Training in data science is a priority for NIDA, and it's supported by our new Office of Research Training, Diversity, and Disparities. We've organized the seminar series with the full support of our NIDA Director, Dr. Nora Volkov, and the organizers include members of the Division of Neuroscience and Behavior and the Office of Research Training, Diversities, and Disparities. The organizers include myself, Dr. Roger Little, the Deputy Director of the Division of Neuroscience and Behavior, Dr. Wilson Compton, the NIDA Deputy Director and the Acting Director of the Office of Research Training, Diversity, and Disparities, Dr. Albert Avila, the Deputy Director of the Office of Research Training, Diversity, and Disparities, and the Director of the Office of Disparities and Health Disparities, and Dr. Lindsay Friend, the Research and Career Development Program Officer in the Office of Research Training, Diversity, and Disparities. I want to thank Roger, Wilson, Albert, and Lindsay for their help with organizing this seminar series. And I also want to thank the team who has been helping with the technical details, and that includes Usha Charya, Susan Holbrook, Caitlin Dudubois, and David Mazza. For this session, we'll first have an interview with Dr. Mike Tamir, then we'll have a presentation by Dr. Daniel Jacobson, and then we'll have a joint Q&A session where we'll take questions from the audience. Please use the chat box to submit your questions, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. So, introduction to Dr. Mike Tamir. Mike serves as the Chief Machine Learning Scientist and Head of Machine Learning for SIG. He's also UC Berkeley Data Science faculty and the Director of Phronesis Machine Learning Labs. He has led teams of data scientists in the Bay Area as Head of Data Science at Uber ATG, Chief Data Scientist for Intertrust Intact, the Director of Data Science for Metascale Sears, and CSO for Galvanize, where he founded Galvanize U UNH, accredited Master's in Data Science degree, and oversaw the company's transformation from co-working space to data science organization. Mike began his career in academia serving as Mathematics Teaching Fellow for Columbia University before teaching at the University of Pittsburgh. So welcome, Mike, and thank you for joining us this morning. So since data scientist is a relatively new job title, sometimes people aren't exactly sure what a data scientist does. How do you typically describe what you do when asked?
Well, thanks for having me, and welcome everyone. So data scientist as a job title is fairly new. When I got my first job as a data scientist, I had to Google it. I didn't know what it meant, and so you know, so not so long ago, but long enough ago, there weren't billions of articles, but on Medium on what is a data scientist and what do data scientists do. The term has appeared to evolve a little bit over the past several years. I think that, you know, certainly in the early years there wasn't much definition, whereas on the other end of the tunnel, now data science more and more is not associated with analytics, but is a little bit more of a mix of the core machine learning engineering techniques that you use, or that a lot of data scientists use, and some of the bread and butter data analysis techniques that you have to do. So let me break that down a little bit. First, there is, you know, whenever you get a data set, there's a lot that you need to do in order to just prep the data for modeling. And certainly when I think about the job of being a data scientist, it usually involves some sort of forecasting or creating, you know, algorithmic estimators. But more than that, there's what I say, you know, often you know, in the job, you know, we'll build these deep learning models, and maybe they have to be trained for months, and you have these results, and then you get your estimations on a certain phenomenon, and then you have to say, okay, now it's time for the data science work, where you actually go through, you look at all of the residuals of your performance of your data. You dig into where you're making mistakes, where you're not making mistakes. You start to produce hypotheses about why did this particular model do well here and not do well there. You have to involve, it involves a lot of bread and butter statistical and experimental techniques, like making sure you stratify right, making sure you're using the right metrics, making sure you have the right sort of experimental design when you're seeing if one particular technique improves or doesn't improve. And so there is a lot more science involved. If you think about it, just like computer science, came from this, looking at natural phenomenons and then trying to create hypotheses and approach as a scientist, how do these mechanical objects like computers approach them, and how they run algorithms from a scientific perspective. A lot of what I do day to day, at least now, is for a given set of data, your experimental design is centered around what kind of machine learning, primarily techniques, deep learning techniques, will be able to get at the signal in that. And you're really, and when we have term papers for students, this is how I describe how to think about their term papers. You have a baseline, and then you have that's your control, and then you have a treatment model. I'm going to try this tweak in my architecture. I'm going to try this tweak in my training algorithm, and that's the way you think about it. And returning to that scientific approach really helps to make sure that you're not just kind of randomly pressing buttons or trying to get lucky with a certain neural architecture.
Yeah, it's definitely very interesting to hear how the term has evolved. So along those lines, a lot of people have been rebranding as data scientists. Do you see a need to define data science roles more clearly? And do you see a big difference in the skills needed for academia versus industry?
So I don't think that the rebranding possibly, the cliche is that if you or at least for the past decade has been, if you change your job title on LinkedIn, you get a 20% salary bump, and that's a good strategy, right? That being said, we don't actually have like open JDs for scientists at SIG right now. For data scientists, we have them for machine learning research scientists. We have them for machine learning engineers. Honestly, I would say that that's a lot of that is nominal. The engineers and the research scientists have to do what I usually refer to as the last question is the bread and butter data science work, which really looks at when I say the data science work, I mean the exploring the data, getting manually into feature engineering or data prep for that particular model or tactic that you're going to be using, and the residual analysis, and making sure that you do careful exploration of the residual analysis in order to generate your next hypothesis. That's the scientific, the data science practice. What gets called a data scientist, or that is maybe a little bit vaguer. And I've noticed in some companies, some of the larger companies in particular, sometimes data science is more like a product role. Sometimes it's indistinguishable from machine learning engineer. And so it really, what I would do if you're not sure about what job you're signing up for, I would make sure to ask the hiring manager and ask the other people with that role what their day-to-day is, because that's probably going to be your best insight into what your job is actually going to be.
So you have a couple of different roles right now. What would you say attracted you to your current roles?
So at Susquehanna in particular, I've been or I had been before joining, wondering for quite a long time, if it was even possible to separate signal from noise in such a narrow signal to noise ratio context. This is the sort of situation where you get a lot of data. Usually our problem is not that we don't have enough data volume to support saturation and full training and convergence with as large of a neural network as you want. That's not the issue. The two main issues are with frequency, seeing if you can then, once you are able to separate the signal, can I do it and serve a result in the milliseconds or nanoseconds, whatever it is that you need for certain applications. And there's always a trade-off there, right? The more, the quicker the frequency, the quicker the lower the latency window that you have, the more data you have. Great, that means you can train a neural network and you have all the data you want, right? You've got this wealth of embarrassment of riches, right? Unfortunately, coupled with that is the fact that if you have low latency, then that also means if you create a large enough model that has enough calculations, you may not have enough time to actually use that model, because you need to think about all the ways of for serving to execute just generating that forecast quick enough in order to use it once you get the data. And so that's, you might think, oh, one day I'll work at a company which has all the data in the world, and then I'll be able to do whatever I want. But there's going to be this natural trade-off. It's almost like a bias variance trade-off, where there's a balance in the middle of having enough frequencies to get the data and being able to actually use it. The other thing is just, I mentioned the signal noise ratio. That is a huge area where it just means you have to focus on a lot more of that really careful residual analysis. Any sort of information leakage or error in your metrics where you get like phantom boost to your performance could be very risky, right? Because the signal is so weak that compared to the noise, that these small margins matter, and these small margins are in the neighborhood of what can happen with just small missteps in terms of scientific practice. So that's something else that is an added challenge that attracted me to Susquehanna.
Sounds like a very interesting job. And I know that you do a lot of machine learning. So what are the most interesting applications for machine learning that you've worked on?
So I think you cut out there for a moment. You said what are the most interesting applications in machine learning?
For machine learning that you've worked on.
Well, so my natural place that I like to do research, or that I like to focus continues to be in natural language processing. There's something very interesting about teaching computers how to read and understand language, and I say understand with an asterisk, of course. The last 2 years, give or take, since 2018, or really NeurIPS 2017, which is at the very end of 2017, with transformers, has it has induced a new wave of making us think about what's possible in terms of natural language processing, and that's been very exciting, because you can now use these new tactics. The attention mechanism is kind of turned into what the convolutional layer has been for image processing and for computer vision. Now, not only is it a lot easier to solve natural language-based problems with these techniques, these attention mechanism-based techniques, the transformer techniques, but also they're just getting so huge. Every couple months you hear about Google just came out with one that's on the order of trillions. That's for the record, it's give or take 1.5 trillion connections in your brain. So we're getting into the right order of magnitude of how many parameters, parameters in a neural network to neurons in your brain. And in fact, the way that Google did it was probably a lot truer to the way the connections in your brain are made, which is that you have these little submodules, this mixture of experts of different parts of the neural network are responsible for different kinds of questions and get activated in different contexts. And so, some of the work that I've done in that more recently is, thinking about how do you deal with things like the fake news problem? How do you try to sort fact from fiction, or more attractively, how do you sort manipulation from honest and non-manipulative information exchange? And is there something that you can actually detect in the way people use language, is the way people use use language when they write journal articles, the way they use language when they write blogs, the way they use language when they're doing what's more punditry or influence peddling, and it seems like, even for, sources like RT, which is, Russian propaganda sites, you're able to at least detect some of that signal that are telltale signs that, this is not journalism. This is not a scientific paper. This is something that's intending to do more, and that more has to do with manipulating our human emotions when we read stuff, rather than our logical assessment when we think about things.
Yeah, it's very exciting to hear about these advancements, but it's definitely very important to consider all these critical issues. So some of the long-term implications about transitioning from ultra big data models to Turing questions. Can you tell us more about your thoughts on this?
Sure. There's so Turing question being, can we create machines that are indistinguishable from an experience perspective of talking with them, or at least interacting with words with a machine versus a human? And so Turing test being it may or may not have been Turing's original intent, but it's too late now. A machine passes the test if you can't tell the difference, right? And so if as many people guess that the machine is a human as they would for humans, just naturally making the mistake that a human is a machine, or vice versa, then it passes the test. And Turing machines are, or sorry, not Turing machines, modern ultra big models, these language models, as we call it. So a language model is just this this construct of I give words, I input words, and then it produces a it continues that string of words in an appropriate way, in a way that sounds fluid and appropriate and in context for whatever words prompted it. That's a language model. And so we experience language models all the time, or at least, well, now they're actually transformer based too, but when you do autocomplete in your browser, that is a language model when it tries to tell you what word you're probably going to say next, and gives you an option for that search. Now, actually, as of I think 18 months ago, Google has introduced transformers even to that process of a select search. Will use transformer models. These very big models like GPT, first there was GPT-1, and then GPT-2, and then GPT-3, which had the crown for the most parameters as of a year ago, and now there's one. Microsoft and Google have come up with slightly bigger ones. All of these are focused on just pouring on more and more and more and more parameters, more neurons, more connections between those neurons. For each connection is a parameter, in order to get better at finding the response, the appropriate response. But these are still fundamentally language models. And so they do fascinating things, like you can ask factual questions of GPT-3, like who was the president in 1876, and it'll probably get it right. But it's just a language model. It can just find what's the most appropriate response given the prompting. So you can also ask it who was the president of the United States in 1776, and or sorry, not 1776, 1676, and it'll respond with perfect Dunning-Kruger confidence. Well, the president was William Penn, or someone who's important and was a relevant figure of the time and can get that context right, but doesn't have any sort of self-auditing of does this make sense? Was there were these additional facts, like United States was not even a twinkle in the eye of Americans yet. It won't be able to tell that. And so I forget it was LeCun or Bengio. I'm gonna roughly paraphrase. There's a lot of criticism that these language models are not fully robust general AI, and the comparison was that he made is comparing a language model to generalized AI is like comparing a high altitude aircraft to a rocket to the moon. They're just still trying to do different things, and so we're not there yet, although the technology is certainly a step in the right direction.
So to talk a little bit more about the Turing test, it was one of the most important milestones in the research and development of AI, but it seems that now the focus has turned more to making human-computer interactions as smooth as possible. What are your thoughts on this, and where do you see this going in the future?
Well, it's not there it's not there yet in terms of when you're waiting on hold, or when you're you sign into your I don't know, your bank or something, and then they have their own version of Siri, and it tries to answer a question and can't, right? There is still a lot to do in terms of practical applications of chatbots and using these language models. Much of that probably has to do with the this mix of being able to respond fluently and even contentfully by pure language model, brute force language model means, versus being able to understand, what is the restricted context of what this person is looking for. Siri and Alexa and a lot of these digital assistants really lean, as wonderful and amazing as neural architectures have been in increasing fluently. Digital assistants mostly rely on drop-down menus and trying to classify what's the question of a list of questions that I'm going to be asked, and everything else is I don't deal with that. My 3-year-old daughter will sometimes get a hold of the phone and especially since we can't take her to play dates in the age of COVID, has made very good friends with having long conversations with Siri. But they're very rote responses, and you can start to see the patterns of those nowadays, or in this day and age, I should say.
So artificial intelligence has made a lot of things possible that previously seemed impossible. What things seem impossible now do you think might become a reality in the near future, or just in the future in general?
It's a good question. One thing that one thing that I keep coming back to adding this, what's the gap between language models and generalized AI? That's a big one. There are also gaps in every time we have a big breakthrough in reinforcement learning or in vision or in what I'm thinking about is image captioning, which really is a combination of language model or natural language processing, deep natural language processing, and image processing. How do we connect these? So there was a paper by Bender that came out last year, which the title was something like towards NLU, natural language understanding, or the mountain of NLU, something like that. And it was written from a linguistics perspective, or the perspective of a linguist, I should say, of how do we know when someone has an understanding of a term, which is a very different question from someone can use a term, or maybe is a different question. That's what's interesting. Of a term that they've never, you say a cat or a lunchbox, right? How do you know that it's completely ungrounded? This machine is sitting on a desk or in a server center somewhere, has never interacted with the lunchbox, but can talk about lunchboxes and give the right context for a lunchbox and tell you what goes into a lunchbox, sandwiches, but not dump trucks, that sort of thing. But in a sense, it's ungrounded usage, even though it's perfectly contentful and perfectly appropriate usage. And so one part of grounding that kind of learning, machine learning, is by adding to it not just the context of using the words and when you use the words and with in context of what other words, but also direct what you might think of as the analog of direct experience, right? So being able to see a lunchbox and identify images of lunchboxes and create text, like text captioning, which, while something that where we are with text captioning at this point is captioning at this point is far beyond where 8 years ago I thought we would be in turn of the new decade, is still not the magnificent of 99%. Oh, this is always appropriate. At best, we are hitting up against the wall of well, there's a lot of different ways you can caption something, and when you're working with machine translation, summarization or text, anytime there's free form, knowing what the right answer is when there's multiple ways of describing something is an intrinsic barrier for machine learning, because you need to figure out how to update these models very quickly and how to propagate the errors, the grading correction through each of the parameters. And so having the right metrics, there's a lot of noise there, especially if you only have one or two labels of what the right text is. And so I think that's really where it would be interesting to see us move next. Is number one, theoretically it seems very difficult to solve these free text problems. So it's one area I'd love to see improvement in, but also just seeing improvement in some of these hybrid contexts where you're using vision and if not sound, then at least text. And combining that with you've seen that a little bit in reinforcement learning, where a lot of these world model techniques are focused on giving a reinforcement learning agent a model, a visual model, where they can observe the environment around them and then compress that into a much more manageable space, and then start doing these high speed predictions about what's likely to happen and what are you forecasting. If I take this action, then what will happen, and do this what's called the technical concept of machine planning. But we haven't seen that. We haven't seen all of these together yet, and that's really where I think it'd be interesting to see the industry grow in the future.
It's definitely interesting to think about what's going to happen in the future. And along those same lines, there has been some concern and hype about AI capabilities and how it will impact humans. What are your thoughts on this?
I was so when I was at Uber, we were working on self-driving, and Uber since sold that division. But I was sitting in the car with another Uber employee. I was driving, and we were chatting about what that's going to mean. He certainly wasn't worried, and I'm not too worried for robots taking the job of Uber drivers anytime soon. but at some point, he said the phrase, well, one day the only job that's going to be left is programming the robots that do all of our jobs, and that's certainly something that an approach I take when I think about my kids' education. Trying to luckily there's Minecraft, so it's very easy to teach kids to get into coding if they like to play video games. I don't know that it's going to be as big of an impact to a lot of that impact is that we've already seen with manufacturing. There are certain repetitive but more more skilled or more complicated tasks like driving that may be replaced, but then there's going to be a whole host of techniques or of needs that are going to be behind that, involved with maintaining the technology that supports these. So certainly anyone taking this class is in the right on the right side of things, getting the technical training that you need. I would not I would not shy away from any program that makes sure that any education program that makes sure that coding is part of the standard part of the curriculum at some point, and certainly that's the future. That was what Galvanize was really focused on, was in filling those gaps after the fact. I don't know that boot camps is really the right approach for that sort of thing, but master's programs and undergraduate education, Berkeley, it's become part of the standard core curriculum to do data science now, and I think that's incredibly farsighted.
Thanks, Mike. It was really great to hear about your career and your perspective on a lot of these questions. Just as a reminder to the audience, we will take some additional questions for both Mike and Dan at the end of the seminar. So next, we're going to have a presentation by Dr. Dan Jacobson. And first, we'll have some virtual applause for Mike. I know it's very hard in this virtual environment, but I know our audience is clapping and happy that you were able to be here for our interview.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Dan Jacobson. Dan is the chief scientist for the computational systems biology at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, which is home to some of the world's largest supercomputers. Dan's research focuses on understanding the complex sets of interactions of molecules of all types across all omics layers and cells that lead to phenotypes, traits, and disease states in organisms, and how all of that is conditional on the surrounding environment. His research team applies these approaches to grand challenges in bioenergy, sustainable agriculture, ecosystems, and human health, and the intersections among these areas. Dan's lab is doing a range of research to address the COVID-19 pandemic, including studies of the molecular evolution of pathogenic elements of coronavirus, molecular mechanisms for pathogenesis, and identification of potential new therapies, environmental variables that affect COVID-19 disease outcomes, and the prediction and prevention of future zoonotic spillovers and pandemics. For this work, Dan has been awarded the 2021 Secretary of Energy's Achievement Award, which is the highest award given by the US DOE, and the 2020 HPC Wire Top HPC-Enabled Science Award. Dan's team was the first group to break the exascale barrier and is happy to have done so for a biology project. At present, this calculation is the fastest scientific calculation ever done anywhere in the world. This project led to his team being awarded the 2018 Gordon Bell Prize, the first ever for systems biology. Dan's career as a computational systems biologist has included leadership roles in academic, corporate, NGO, and national lab settings. His lab focuses on the development and subsequent application of mathematical, statistical, and computational methods to biological data sets in order to yield new insights into complex biological systems. His lab's approaches include the use of network theory and topology discovery clustering, wavelet theory, AI, explainable AI, together with the traditional and more advanced supercomputing architectures. Areas of statistics of particular interest to his lab include the use of both frequentist and Bayesian models, as well as the development of new methods of genome-wide epistasis studies. These mathematical and statistical models are applied to various populations and meta-multi-omics data sets individually, as well as in combination in an attempt to better understand the functional relationships as well as biosynthesis, signaling, transcriptional, translational, degradation, and kinetic regulatory networks at play in biological organisms and communities. His group takes a broad view of biological complexity and evolution that stretches from viruses to microbes to plants to humans. So let's welcome Dan, and I see that you have your slides ready. So take it away, Dan. It was fascinating to hear about your research, and congratulations on the new computation. I can't wait to hear details about that when they're available. So a round of applause for Dan. And so now we're going to turn it over to Dr. Lindsay Friend, who's going to be moderating questions from the chat. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box, and I'll turn it over to Lindsay.
Who is muted? It's not a Zoom session unless somebody's muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Sorry about that. Okay, great. Thank you again for your talks. Sorry for the technical problems. The first question I think is directed at Mike. You discussed gaps and being grounded when you're discussing the language analysis portion. So the question is, can you give another kind of real world example using those terms and how they would apply to another scenario?
For when when something is grounded versus ungrounded in machine usage. So maybe I'll try to think of two cases. One is text in general, right? So I mentioned large language models and how they may not interact with the things to which the text tokens ostensibly refer. That's the case. That's been the case for not just more recent transformer models, but also historical, just pure word embeddings. Certainly something that that we've had to be very mindful of and make sure that we are ruling out as appropriate is there are a lot of these models learn from text that humans use, and humans are filled with implicit and unfortunately too frequently just as often explicit biases. And this means that when a machine learns from written text that is filled with those biases, it also learns those biases. There are some famous examples of Twitter bots that were created by AIs that became inexplicably racist. And that's something that you have to be very careful that you're not teaching a machine to follow these patterns. Now, there's been some great work in how to screen out certain biases, but this is by far not a solved problem. And so there's this balance between this idea that meaning is use. And so if people use terms in a certain way, then that's what they mean by those terms. And meaning is intention. And finding a way to balance between those two poles becomes especially germane when you realize that the usage that people have is not always either the appropriate usage or the intended usage. And so that's when these two sort of views of what meaning is kind of peel apart. So that's maybe not another example, but another aspect of both grounding and usage of terms versus the actual meaning of those terms and what those terms are representing. Ungrounded in terms of another context. So usually the concept of groundedness is tied to text. I'm tempted to say that in image classification, when you start to detect objects or misclassify, get false positives for objects based on spurious features. So in particular situations like where you have where you have adversarial features or adversarially trained examples that make that can trick an estimator into thinking that something is, say, a cat when it's not a cat, or whatever the case may be. While it's not the traditional use of ungrounded language, it's certainly related to this idea that there's a difference between being able to recognize why something is worthy of a high estimation of a certain classification, as say a cat, versus not. So both those answers are not other examples, they're just related examples, but hopefully that gets in the ballpark of answering the question.
Great, thank you very much. Another question I think was for Dan. How can data science contribute to the enhancement of treatment specificity through individualized psychosocial interventions? So an intervention focused. Dan?
And that's a great question. That, of course, is really what we're striving towards in trying to understand the underlying genetic architectures as well as influence and environment to get us towards thinking about precision medicine, personalized medicine, finding the right intervention for the right person at the right time. Right now, as I'm sure we're all aware, and prescriptions are really a trial and error game, often trying different medications on people and hoping that they're in the part of the population that will work on. The long-term goal is to really better understand the system's biology and increasingly the psychosocial elements of environment and current and prior stress and exposure that's going to lead to that phenotypic outcome. And then to be able to deliver the right treatment, whether it's pharmaceutical or other psychological interventions that's going to help that patient. That's a long-term goal. I think there's a long ways to go, but trying to gain this fundamental mechanistic understanding and the heterogeneity of that across the population. There's not one size fits all, that you can get the same phenotypic output from a range of different underlying architectures, be they genetic, omic, or environment. That it's that combination of different alleles, combination of different environments with those alleles that leads to an outcome. We tend to classify disease in these sort of very broad categories. I mean, in ICD-9 or ICD-10 code, often is not representing the true underlying biology. It's a clinical pigeonhole that's convenient for billing, convenient for record keeping, but it's not trying to capture all the underlying biology. So we're trying to sort of shine the light and find all the different types of biology that can lead to that diagnosis. And ideally then, in the long term, the vision, of course, is to help clinicians then choose the right therapy for the right person under the right conditions.
I actually had a related question to that, Dan, and that is, if you had the data available for drug side effects, how effective might your approaches be to understanding the unknown biology underlying those?
But funny you should ask that, Roger. We're very much engaged in polypharmacy research, looking at drug interactions, both leveraging the known interactions as well as discovering new interactions as part of that sort of questions. Concomitant with that comes with the unintended consequences, the off-target effects of pharmaceuticals. And so we're looking at and building data sets, again, ranging across the clinical layers of information and comorbidity information, and of course, prescription pharmacy fill and consumption information, along with the molecular details of looking at molecular profiles, of omics profiles of how cells are responding to different drugs. And trying to integrate lots of different types of assays together to get exactly at that question. What can we tell is from known and unknown interaction space? What is from untargeted information? How can we build in the genomics and environment of the underlying patients to tease all that apart? And how can we bring in the structural biology component as well to, once we have candidates for off-target effects, can we show what those interactions are? And long-term goal again is to avoid those in the future, that you can make your therapies more and more specific and contextually specific to minimize the sort of off-target effects.
Great, thank you for that perspective. I think Wilson has a couple questions. Turn it over to him.
Sure, thanks very much. First off, I couldn't count the number of zeros in a zeta up. It's larger than a quadrillion. That's as much as I sort of stopped being able to even imagine. But that's will be wonderful to read the report about that. I was struck as a clinician by your foray into electronic health records, personalized medicine, and the morass that is represented by electronic health records, where your data may come from. I will say that in natural language processing, the fact that there's misinterpretation by a machine isn't always that different from what humans do. People misinterpret written language or verbal language all the time. Try explaining sarcasm to someone who doesn't quite get it. That's an example of how something that can be amusing to one in one context can be quite mean and cutting in another context. Just as one. When we think about medical records, though, this is a huge gap for the addictions field, where substances are not routinely recorded in medical records. We're hoping to take advantage of sort of the free text fields to build some of this. But I'm curious not just about sort of that patchy nature of the data, but the way that sometimes these things are missing in a systematic or biased way. Any thoughts about how we can address that, and how we can use AI and big data approaches to address these inherent limitations of the data systems?
I couldn't agree more. I mean, each EHR records are messy, right? And both the structured data and the unstructured, the text data, bring big challenges. We're fortunate to have the clinical records for 23 million patients going back about 20 years here at Oak Ridge as part of the VA collaboration. And so that gives us really large corpuses or is that corpi? A really large corpus to learn on, and to learn on all the different layers of information. And so what we're finding is, if you look at each layer independently, yes, there's all sorts of challenges with each layer. But as you start to combine them and use these AI and explainable AI approaches together, they start to support each other. So that when are ICD-9 and 10 codes useful? Yes, they're useful. Are they perfect? No, they're not. But if you combine them with lab values, if you combine them with prescription information, if you combine them with outpatient information, as you build all those layers together, they start to support each other. Is it perfect? Sure. No, it's not perfect. But we're starting to get better and better at defining phenotypes, not just from diagnoses codes, but from the whole body of information. And that's one of the hopes in substance abuse, is that from a standpoint of a phenotype, can we learn about what's really predictive of that phenotype that's been sort of rigorously done by surveys and chart reviews? Can we learn the clinical information that's predictive of that and build multivariate proxy phenotypes to find those missing cases? And you're completely right. It's very challenging in substance abuse, and your cases and your controls, making sure your controls aren't contaminated, making sure your cases are truthful. Are your controls exposed controls or not? We can have all sorts of debates about all of those. But by taking the totality of the record, as well as PRO, patient-reported outcomes, patient-reported information, you start to fill in those gaps. And so we're taking those sorts of approaches in a range of different projects and showing the benefit of doing that. So our phenotypes are getting more sophisticated, and as the phenotypes get more sophisticated and closer to biology, the systems biology we can do on them gets better. But you're spot on. It's a really challenging issue, but it's this taking the totality of the data together is our strategy of solving as much of that as we can, and then also filling in by what we can get from patients now. And with apps and increasingly interest in patients in their own treatment and research, that's more and more doable. In other projects we're talking about for a neuropsychological condition, potentially, self-phenotyping, PRO-based for, maybe millions of people. It's a huge distributed app-driven cohort. And then you filter down from that to folks that you want to do really deep phenotyping on. And then you combine with that information from animal models to help you explore that biology as well in ways that you can't do in humans. But yeah, the clinical records are super challenging, but it's the holistic view is where we're starting to get there and seeing some really cool stuff.
Thank you. Mike, I had a question for you about natural language processing in terms of, from what I'm familiar with, most of it's done with English language. Any advantages of using other languages for some of this? Is there more, I don't know enough about linguistics to know whether there might be some languages where it's more precise.
So I don't know about more precise. Certainly there's a lot of efforts in working with other languages as well. There are major I think it's corpora in different languages. Some of this is because of machine translation is a very important application for natural language processing. I'm not super familiar, but I am aware that Facebook and Google are doing a lot of work in trying to come up with embedding models that are almost this like intralingua, particular language independent, so that they can expand to different countries, and they are very pragmatically going from most used to least used in that order in terms of integrating them. And now these are more focused on being able to embed text, in English and in, say Spanish and in Mandarin, versus and then seeing how all of those embeddings can be realigned. I did some research work several years ago now on what can be done with just pure single word embeddings. And if you think about what happens when you embed a language, each word embedding is sort of fuzzy in the sense that there are multiple meanings of the term bank. And so you end up kind of mode averaging, the thing where you put in money and the thing that you do when you go around a turn and the thing that you do, or that you see at the edge of water. But for the most part, these language embeddings are kind of, you can realign them. So you might take German and English and embed the entire constellation of vectors that correspond to the words, and then you can do with a rotation. So orthogonal transformation, you can align the bases of those embeddings and then measure how similar two languages are to one another at a vocab level, with all of that noisiness of multiple senses. And you can even do a little bit of a singular value decomposition of that linear transformation between the two, because the linear transformation is going to be a square matrix, and a square matrix can always be separated out into a rotation, a scale rotation with singular value decomposition. So by analyzing the diagonals on that scaling matrix, you can actually see how close it is to identity, which would be just a pure rotation.
Great. Thank you both for your thoughtful answers. I see that we're at time, so I'm going to turn the mic back over to Susan.
Thank you, Lindsay. So I just want to thank both Dr. Tamir and Dr. Jacobson again for the big round of virtual applause. So it's been really wonderful to hear about both of their careers and their perspectives, and to hear the advice they've given to those considering this career path. I also want to thank the speakers throughout the series, the organizers, the technical team, and the audience. Thank you all for making this seminar series a success. We'd love to hear your feedback about this seminar series and whether there are any other types of seminars you'd like to see about data science careers or just data science in general. It's possible that we may continue this series in the fall or next year. And lastly, I just want to acknowledge that there are several fellowships and job opportunities for data science at NIH that are available to both students and professionals. These opportunities are coordinated by the NIH Office of Data Science Strategy, which is doing a tremendous job of coordinating and inspiring data science activities across NIH. One program is the Data Scholars Program, which is geared towards experienced data scientists And I believe they're still taking applications until April 9th. So there's still some time if you're interested in applying. There's also the Civic Digital Fellowship Program, which is geared towards undergraduate and graduate students. And there's also a graduate data science program for master's level students. So if you're interested, I would urge you to check out the website for additional details. And I just want to thank everyone again, and please feel free to contact me or any of the other organizers with any questions or feedback. So thanks, everyone.